The ring caught the last light of the afternoon sun just as the stagecoach rolled into Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, and that thin flash of gold was the first thing Harvey Warren noticed about the woman stepping down onto the dusty Main Street with her jaw set like she intended to own the whole territory. Theodora Conley was 26 years old, and she had never been west of the Missouri River before that morning. She had packed everything she owned into a single leather traveling trunk, sold her late father's pocket watch to cover the coach fare, and worn her best green cotton dress because she believed that first impressions were a form of armor. The dress was wrinkled beyond saving by the time she stepped onto the boardwalk in front of Caldwell's only hotel, but her chin was up and her brown eyes were clear, and on the third finger of her right hand, she wore a small gold ring set with a chip of pale blue turquoise that had belonged to her mother. Harvey was leaning against the post of the livery stable across the street when she arrived. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 days. He worked cattle for a man named Gideon Prout, whose ranch sat 12 miles south of town, and he had ridden in that afternoon to collect a supply of horseshoe nails and a sack of dried beans, which was not the kind of errand that ordinarily changed the direction of a man's life. He watched Theodora step down from the coach, watched her press one hand flat against the small of her back to work out the stiffness of the long journey, and watched the sunlight strike that ring and send a thin, bright needle of gold across the dust. He did not speak to her then. He was not a man who rushed at things. Theodora collected her trunk from the coach driver, tipped him 3 cents because that was every coin she could spare, and carried the trunk herself to the hotel because the porter was busy with a merchant's shipment of dry goods, and she was not the kind of woman who waited. The hotel was called the Frontier House, which she thought was both uninspired and accurate. The room they gave her was narrow, with a single window that looked out over the back alley, a rope-strung bed, and a washstand with a chipped enamel basin. It cost her 40 cents a night, which meant she had to find work inside of 2 weeks or she would be sleeping in the church. She had come to Caldwell because of an advertisement posted in the St. Louis newspaper by a woman named Mrs. Edith Carver, who ran the town's only millinery and dress shop and required a skilled seamstress. Theodora had been a seamstress in St. Louis for 4 years. She was good at it. She was precise and quick, and she could look at a woman's shape and know before a single pin was placed exactly how the fabric needed to fall. She had written to Mrs. Carver, and Mrs. Carver had written back, and the job was not exactly promised, but was something close enough to a promise that Theodora had packed her trunk and bought her fare and come. She washed the road dust from her face and hands in the chipped basin, pinned her dark hair back into something respectable, and went directly to the dress shop, which was 2 buildings down from the hotel on the east side of the main street. The bell above the door rang when she pushed it open, and the smell of lavender sachet and fresh cotton came out to meet her. Mrs. Edith Carver was a compact, energetic woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pinned severely at the back of her head and quick, assessing eyes. She looked at Theodora the way a horse trader looks at a horse. She checked her hands first, which Theodora understood and did not take as an insult, because a seamstress's hands told the truth about her work. "You're stitching samples," Mrs. Carver said. Theodora opened her carpetbag and produced a folded piece of linen on which she had sewn 12 different stitch patterns, from a simple running hem to an elaborate decorative chain stitch, all of them clean and even. Mrs. Carver studied the linen for a long moment without expression. Then she folded it carefully and set it on the counter. "You can start Monday," she said. 6 days a week, 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, $1.50 a week. It was less than she had made in St. Louis, but Theodora nodded and said, "That is acceptable," because out here in Caldwell, Kansas, with $12.20 in her purse and nobody in the world who knew her name, acceptable was what she had. She shook Mrs. Carver's hand and walked back out into the afternoon sun. Harvey Warren was still across the street, loading his supply sacks onto the back of a dun-colored mule. He looked up when she came out of the dress shop, and for a moment their eyes met across the wide, dusty space of the street, and Theodora felt the look like a hand pressing briefly against her shoulder. She looked away first and walked back toward the hotel. Harvey watched her go. He watched the ring catch the light one more time as she tucked her carpetbag under her arm, and he made a decision, quiet and without drama, the way he made most of his decisions. He would ask someone in town who she was. He was not ready to walk up to a strange woman on the street, but he could ask. That was within the range of things a reasonable man might do. He asked the hotel's front desk clerk, a young man named Dale Pitt, who knew everything about everyone who came through Caldwell, because the front desk of a frontier hotel was the most efficient information-gathering post in the territory. "New woman," Dale said, looking pleased to have something worth reporting. "Just came in on the afternoon coach. Name's Conley, Theodora Conley. She's taking the seamstress position over at Mrs. Carver's shop. Came from St. Louis near as I can tell." Harvey thanked him, collected his nails and his beans from the general store, and rode south toward the Prout Ranch with Theodora Conley's name settling quietly into his mind the way a stone settles into still water, sending out rings long after the splash is gone. The Prout Ranch was a working cattle operation of about 8,000 acres, and Harvey had been there for 4 years. He had come to Caldwell from a ranch in Texas, following the cattle drives north and finding that he liked the Kansas grasslands better than the Texas brush. Gideon Prout was a fair employer, not a generous one, but fair, which was more than many men in Harvey's position could claim. Harvey had his own small bunkhouse room, 3 meals a day, and $35 a month. He was not a wealthy man, but he was not a struggling one either, and he had been putting money aside in a tin box under his floorboard with some vague, unexamined intention of one day owning his own piece of land. He did not ride back into Caldwell the next day. He had work to do, and besides, he was not going to appear desperate. He rode in 4 days later on a Saturday, ostensibly to get a haircut at the barber shop, which was something he did every 3 weeks, and which therefore required no special explanation. He was sitting in the barber's chair when Theodora walked past the window, and he watched her through the glass without turning his head. She was wearing a different dress today, a dark blue one, and she had a basket over her arm, and she was walking with purpose toward the general store. She stopped once to look at something in the window of the saddlery, and in the clear Saturday afternoon light he could see the ring on her right hand quite plainly. When the barber finished and he paid and stepped outside, he almost walked past her because she had come back out of the general store and was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking down at a list she held in her hand, her brow slightly furrowed. She had eggs in her basket and a small paper-wrapped parcel that was probably salt or flour. "Excuse me," Harvey said, and he said it before he had worked out what came next. Theodora looked up. Her brown eyes were direct and composed. She was not a woman who startled easily. "I noticed your ring," Harvey said, because that was the truth, and he was a man who defaulted to truth when he was uncertain about what else to do. "The blue stone. I hope you don't mind my asking about it. I have not seen many like it." Theodora looked down at the ring on her right hand, then back up at him. A slow, careful expression moved across her face. It was not quite a smile yet, but it was the beginning of considering one. "It was my mother's," she said. "It's beautiful," Harvey said. "The stone is turquoise." "It is. She got it from a trader in Kentucky when she was very young before she was married. She wore it every day of her life." Theodora paused. "She passed 4 years ago. I wear it to remember her." There was nothing calculated in the way she said it. It was simply the truth, offered plainly, which Harvey recognized because he spoke the same language. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant it in a way that was not merely polite. "I'm Harvey Warren. I work cattle for Prout, south of town." "Theodora Conley," she said. "I just started at Mrs. Carver's shop." "I heard," he said, and then immediately felt that made him sound like he had been asking around, which of course he had, but it seemed imprudent to say so. "Small town," he added. The beginnings of that smile completed themselves. "Very small," she agreed. They stood there in the afternoon light with the sounds of Caldwell going on around them, horses and wagon wheels and someone hammering something 3 buildings down, and Harvey was aware that this was not a moment he wanted to end prematurely. "Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee at the hotel dining room?" he asked. "If you've time and inclination. They keep it on all afternoon." Theodora looked at him steadily for a moment. She was assessing him with the same careful, unhurried attention that she gave to a length of fabric she was about to cut. She checked his eyes, which were honest. She checked his hands, which were working hands. She checked the condition of his clothes, which were clean, worn but mended, which told her something about his habits. She checked whether he held his hat at his side, which he did, which told her something about his mother's manners or somebody's. "I have time," she said. The hotel dining room had 6 tables covered with white oilcloth and a counter along one wall where a stout woman named Mrs. Jennings kept the coffee urn going. Harvey held the door and Theodora walked in ahead of him, which was how it should be, and they took a table near the window. The coffee was strong and hot and was served in heavy ceramic cups. They put sugar in theirs and drank it slowly, and they talked. They talked about small things at first the way 2 careful people do: the weather, the condition of the road from the rail depot, whether the grasslands around Caldwell were good for cattle, and then gradually about larger things, because the small things were just the vestibule of a conversation, not the room itself. She told him she had grown up in southern Illinois, that her father had been a school teacher and her mother had kept a garden and made excellent apple butter, that after both her parents died she had gone to St. Louis for work and found it in the garment trade, that she had come west because she had a feeling, which she recognized was not the most logical basis for a decision, that the West was the place where a person's history mattered less than their capacity for work and their willingness to show up every day and do it. He listened without interrupting, which she noticed and appreciated. He told her he had grown up in Tennessee, that his father had died in the war, that he had gone to Texas at 17 to work cattle because it was the only work that paid and the open land made him feel like breathing, was easier than it had ever been in his life, that he had come north with the drives and stayed because Kansas suited him, that he intended one day to have his own piece of land and raise cattle on it, and perhaps wheat as well because he believed diversification was a form of wisdom. She listened to all of that and then she said, "That is a very good plan." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You think so?" "Wheat does not have the unpredictability of cattle," she said. "Bad seasons aside, that is precisely my thinking." They looked at each other and understood that they were both people who thought carefully about things, which was a considerable and rare form of compatibility. The afternoon was well into its golden last hour when Theodora looked at the light coming through the window and said she ought to get back to her room. She had fabric to prepare for Monday's first day of work. Harvey stood when she stood, because his mother had been quite specific about that. He walked her to the hotel door and stopped there. "Miss Conley," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands the way he did when he was about to say something that mattered to him. "I would very much like to do this again." "Have coffee," she said. "Talk to you," he said, because that was the accurate word. She was quiet for a moment. The last of the afternoon sun was behind the buildings now, and the street was in the first blue shadow of evening. The ring on her right hand was in shadow too, the turquoise no longer catching light but still present, still worn. "I am at Mrs. Carver's shop Monday through Saturday," she said. "I walk back to the hotel at 6 in the evening." Harvey understood what that meant. He understood it as clearly as if she had handed him a written schedule and said, "Here is where I will be if you choose to appear." He was too good a reader of plain speech to miss it. "I'll be in town next Saturday," he said. "I expect the street will be busy," she said, which was as clear a yes as he was going to get and was quite clear enough. She went inside. Harvey stood on the boardwalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and then he settled his hat back on his head and walked to the livery to collect his horse. The week that followed was a working week, which meant Harvey was up before 5 in the morning and in the saddle by 6, riding fence lines or moving cattle from one pasture to another, or doing the 1,000 other physical tasks that constituted working cattle on the Kansas plains. He did not think about Theodora every minute of every hour because he was a practical man and cattle required attention, but he thought about her at the edges of things, in the quiet of early morning before the work began, and in the settling dark of evening when the hands sat outside the bunkhouse and let the day go out of their muscles. He mentioned her to no one. He was a private person by disposition, and besides, he had nothing definite to report. A cup of coffee and a conversation was not a courtship. It was a beginning which was different. At Mrs. Carver's shop, Theodora was discovering that her new employer was a demanding woman but a fair one, which was the same thing Harvey had said about Gideon Prout, and which suggested that Caldwell, Kansas attracted a certain type of employer. The work was demanding in a way she found satisfying. She was altering a riding skirt for the wife of a local rancher, hemming curtains for the new schoolhouse, and beginning a dress order for a young woman named Clara Briggs, who was to be married in September and who had very decided opinions about the construction of her sleeves. The shop was a good source of information about the town, because women who came in for fittings talked. Theodora listened. She learned that Caldwell was a cattle town sitting at the end of the Kishom Trail, that the cattle business was at its height, and the town was prosperous because of it, and that the prosperity had a rough edge to it because cattle towns attracted not only cowboys but also the men who followed cowboys looking for their money. There had been trouble in the saloons in the spring. A man had been shot. The town was in the process of trying to establish more order, and the debate over whether to strengthen the marshal's office was a heated one. She learned also that Harvey Warren was considered by the women of the town to be a reliable and decent man. She did not ask directly. She simply listened, and his name came up once in the context of a dispute he had helped settle between two neighboring ranchers, doing so by standing as a neutral witness and telling exactly what he had seen, which had resolved the matter fairly and at no small social cost to himself because one of the ranchers had been his own employer. The woman who told this story mentioned it in passing, as a small detail, but Theodora filed it carefully. Saturday came. Harvey rode into Caldwell with a cleaner shirt and a freshly oiled saddle, which were his concessions to vanity. At 6:30 in the evening, he was standing on the boardwalk outside Mrs. Carver's shop when Theodora came out, and she looked at him when she pushed the door open, and he thought she might be pleased, though she was careful about her expressions in public. "Harvey," she said. "Good evening," he said. They walked together in the direction of the hotel, which was the most natural path, and the walk itself became a conversation, slow and pleasant, because the evening was warm and the main street was busy enough to feel alive but not so crowded as to be oppressive. She told him about Clara Briggs's sleeves. He told her about a difficult stretch of fence line on the east boundary of the Prout property. They talked easily, with the comfort of two people who had already done the work of discovering they could. At the hotel door, he asked if she would take supper with him at the dining room. She considered it for exactly 2 seconds and said yes. They sat at the same table with the white oilcloth and ordered the evening meal, which was beef stew and cornbread, and they talked through supper and then stayed at the table, while Mrs. Jennings refilled their coffee cups twice. And by the time they walked out of the dining room, the evening was full dark, and the street outside was lit by lanterns hanging from the saloon doorways and the hotel porch. Harvey walked her to the foot of the stairs, and there was a moment where the conversation paused in the particular way it does when both people are aware that something is shifting, some small but significant alignment of things. "I want to be straightforward with you," Harvey said, turning his hat in his hands again. "I am 31 years old. I work for another man's ranch, but I have plans and I have savings and I am not without prospects. I find your company more valuable than any company I have kept in a considerable while. I would like to see you regularly, if that is agreeable to you." Theodora looked at him in the lamplight. His face was serious and honest and not unkind. She had been forming an opinion of him over 2 meetings now, and the opinion was good. She was a careful woman and she did not romanticize things, but she was also honest, and honesty required her to admit that she thought about him during the week and that she had been aware of his presence outside the shop door before she had even opened it, like a weather change that the body detects before the mind catches up. "I would find that agreeable," she said. Harvey let out a breath. "Good," he said simply. "Good night, Harvey. Good night, Theodora." She went upstairs. He stood on the porch for a moment in the cool dark, looking out at the lit street and the wide black sky above the roof lines, and something that had been sitting quietly in him for a long time felt, not moved exactly, but attended to. The weeks that followed had a shape to them. Harvey came to town every Saturday. Sometimes he found occasion to come midweek as well, when supplies were needed or when he had business at the land office, where he had begun to inquire, quietly and with no rush, about parcels of land in the vicinity. He and Theodora walked and had supper and talked. They talked about everything. She told him about her childhood in Illinois in more detail, the way her mother had sung in the kitchen on Sunday mornings and kept her garden plots with the precision of a general managing a campaign, the way her father had read to her every evening from whatever book he was working through, history mostly, but also some poetry. Harvey told her about Tennessee and about the war's shadow on everything, how his father's absence had shaped the household into a different shape than it would otherwise have been, how his mother had managed with a severity that was not cruelty but was necessity, and how he had always respected her for it even when it was hard. He told her about the plains, about what it meant to him to ride out before dawn and watch the grasslands come into color as the sky changed, the way the light moved across the land in long traveling sheets, the way a man could feel very small and very present at the same time in a place that large. He told it to her without self-consciousness, which was the most honest way to tell it, and she listened with the quality of attention he was coming to understand was characteristic of her, absorbed and genuine and not performing interest but actually having it. She told him she had been afraid, when the coach rolled west across the Missouri, in a way she had not let herself acknowledge at the time because acknowledging fear before the thing that causes it is resolved felt to her like a form of defeat. She had been afraid that the frontier would be violent and lawless and blunt in a way that left no room for the things she valued, the small precise pleasures of skilled work and good conversation, and the kind of beauty that has to be looked for rather than announced. "And is it?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment in the way that told him she was giving the question its due weight. "Not entirely," she said. He smiled at that, which he did not do frequently enough that it became cheap, and she smiled back, and he thought that was the most becoming thing he had ever seen. In September, Clara Briggs was married at the Caldwell church in the dress that Theodora had made, sleeves and all, and Theodora attended the wedding at Mrs. Carver's invitation. Harvey was there as well, brought by a ranch hand who was the cousin of the groom. They had not coordinated this. They found each other across the room with the slight, pleased surprise of 2 people whose lives are gradually becoming arranged around the same events, and they sat together at the celebration supper afterward and danced once to the fiddle music, which was Harvey's suggestion and Theodora's willing agreement. She was a good dancer, which surprised him slightly, and he told her so, and she said her mother had taught her, and when she said it she touched the ring on her right hand without thinking about it, just a light press of her thumb against the band, and Harvey saw it and understood it for what it was, a small private language between a living daughter and a gone mother, conducted through gold and turquoise. He found himself with enormous respect for a woman he had never known, because of what she had clearly left behind in her daughter. October came and the cattle drives were winding down for the season, and with them the particular kind of rough energy that a cattle town accumulates during the drive months. The saloon troubles quieted. The streets were less crowded. Caldwell settled into its quieter self, and Harvey found himself riding into town more often, twice a week now with a regularity that had ceased to require excuses. He had business at the land office. He had business at the hardware store. He had business, fundamentally, with Theodora Conley, which was not a thing he said aloud to his colleagues at the ranch, but which Gideon Prout had deduced without being told, because Gideon Prout had been married for 25 years and recognized the signs. "You're tidier on Tuesday nights than you are any other time," Gideon said one evening, which was the most he ever said on the subject, and Harvey did not dignify it with a response. The land he had been looking at was 160 acres, 6 miles south of Caldwell, along a creek that ran with enough reliability to be useful. It was homestead land under the Homestead Act, available for the filing fee and 5 years of improvement. He had the money. He had the knowledge. What he had not had until recently was the specific weight of a future that required a piece of land rather than just a bunkhouse room. He thought about this carefully over the course of October. He thought about timing and about what it meant to have feelings that were decisive before the circumstances were fully arranged. He was a man who liked to have things in order, but he was also honest enough with himself to acknowledge that some things did not wait for order, and that waiting for perfect circumstances was a method of never doing anything. In early November, he took Theodora for a walk on a Sunday afternoon. This was not their usual pattern, Sundays being her only full day away from the shop, and she had agreed to it with a look that suggested she understood something was different about the occasion. They walked out of town along the South Road, which Harvey had suggested because it took them past the creek land he had been looking at, though he did not mention this. They walked until the town was small behind them and the grasslands opened up, wide and pale gold in the November light, the sky enormous and very blue above them. They stopped near the creek, where a line of cottonwood trees had gone yellow and were dropping their leaves in the mild wind. The water was clear and shallow and made a sound that was all the more noticeable for the general silence around them. "This land here," Harvey said, looking out across it, "between this creek and the South Road." 160 acres. Theodora looked around. She looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the flat, unbroken run of grass to the horizon. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about filing for it," he said. "Building on it, a proper house, not a soddy, though that would be the start of it. Running my own cattle and perhaps some wheat in the east field where the soil looks deep." He stopped. He was looking at the land, not at her, because he was not yet ready to look at her while he said the next part. "I've been thinking," he said again, more slowly, "that it is not the kind of thing a man ought to do alone. The building of it, the years of it." The wind moved through the cottonwoods. A leaf came loose and turned over twice before it settled on the creek's surface and was carried away. Theodora turned to look at him. He turned to look at her at the same moment, and they were very close, the way people are when they have been walking side by side for a considerable distance. "Harvey," she said carefully, "are you telling me something specific?" "I am working up to it," he said, with a directness that was also a kind of honesty about his own difficulty. "I am not a man who says things easily, but I will say this plainly. I have not felt about anyone in my life the way I feel about you. I would like to build this place, and I would like to build it with you. I am asking you to consider marrying me." He said it the way he did most things, without ornamentation, and it landed that way, clean and real, and without any of the evasion that fancy words can sometimes be used to accomplish. Theodora was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with those direct brown eyes, and he held still under the look because he had learned by now that she thought seriously before she spoke, and that interrupting that process was the wrong thing to do. She thought about the ring on her right hand. She thought about her mother wearing it in a Kentucky town before she was married, wearing it every day of her life, pressing it to the same finger through every season of her life, until that life was done. She thought about what it meant to carry that ring west on a stagecoach and have it noticed in the first afternoon by a man who asked about it before dark, who wanted to know where it came from not because of its value, but because beauty that carries meaning is worth asking after. She thought about 4 years of quiet grief in St. Louis, and the feeling on the coach westward that she was going toward something she could not name yet. "Yes," she said. Harvey blinked. He had prepared for more negotiation. "Yes." He said, "Yes, Harvey, I will marry you." He was still for one more second, just processing, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, a kind of luminous relief, a warmth that he usually kept close and controlled opening out briefly and completely. He took her hands in his, both of them, and held them and looked at her. "We'll do this right," he said. "I'll file the land claim this week. We can be married at the church here if that suits you, whenever you're ready. I won't rush you." "Next month," she said, which was not the answer of a woman who needed to be convinced. "Give me a month to get Mrs. Carver organized. I don't want to leave her without a seamstress and no notice." "Next month," he agreed. They walked back to town in the late afternoon with the grasslands turning from gold to amber around them, and the sky going the deep clear blue of early evening. Harvey held her hand as they walked, which was the first time he had done so, and she let him, and they did not talk much for the rest of the walk, but the silence was the good kind, the kind that is full rather than empty. The month that followed was busy with practical arrangements. Harvey filed his homestead claim at the land office and paid the filing fee of $14, which consumed a portion of his savings but left enough for the beginning of a house. He gave notice to Gideon Prout, who received it with a nod and a handshake and the comment that Harvey had been the best fence man he'd ever employed, which was Gideon's highest form of praise. Theodora gave Mrs. Carver 3 weeks' notice rather than 1, because she had said a month and meant it. Mrs. Carver received the news with an expression of controlled regret. She was not a sentimental woman, but she had a clear appreciation for good work, and Theodora did good work, and she said so. "You'll be wanting to finish Miss Holton's order before you go," Mrs. Carver said, which was her way of saying she accepted the situation. "I planned to," Theodora said. There were complications, as there always are. Harvey's plans for the house required lumber, and lumber on the Kansas plains was expensive because it came a long way from the north by rail, and the cost of materials was higher than he had estimated. He sat down with his tin box and his figures and worked the numbers several ways before he accepted that the house would have to be built in stages, the main room and kitchen first, the bedroom and additional rooms as money allowed. This was not a defeat. This was just arithmetic. He told Theodora this without softening it. "We'll start with what we have and build what we need," she said, with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything practical, and that was the end of the anxiety about it. She had a conversation with Mrs. Carver that neither of them discussed openly afterward, but the result of which was that, when Theodora left the shop, she carried with her a collection of fabric remnants that Mrs. Carver had marked as unsaleable, good cotton, and wool in various cuts and colors that would be useful for curtains and bedding, and the 100 other textile needs of a household being built from nothing. They were married on a Saturday afternoon in December in the Caldwell church, on a day that was cold and very clear. The sky outside the church windows was an intense winter blue. Harvey wore his good dark suit, which he had bought in Wichita 2 years prior and had worn since to exactly one funeral, and it fit him well enough. Theodora wore a dress she had made herself from a length of dove-gray wool, fitted precisely, the collar trimmed with a narrow band of darker gray ribbon. She had done her own hair in a smooth, careful arrangement, and she wore her mother's ring on her right hand. And Harvey noticed it when she came up the aisle because he always noticed it. And he thought of the afternoon she had first arrived in Caldwell, and how the ring had caught the sun, and how all of this, the church and the cold, clear sky and Theodora herself moving toward him, had somehow been contained in that moment. The minister was a man named Reverend Aldous Finch, who had been in Caldwell for 3 years and who took his work seriously. The ceremony was short and unhurried. Harvey and Theodora made their promises clearly and without wavering. Harvey put a plain gold band on her left hand that he had bought at the jeweler in Wichita on his last supply run. When he put it on her finger, Theodora's right hand, the one with her mother's ring, curled briefly into a fist and then relaxed. Afterward, there was a small supper at the hotel dining room, attended by Mrs. Carver, two of Harvey's former ranch colleagues who had driven in from the Prout property, Dale, the desk clerk who was invited because Harvey felt he had a debt to the man for his information 4 months earlier, and a woman named Florence Adair, who was Theodora's closest acquaintance in Caldwell, a quiet schoolteacher who had taken her meals at the hotel and formed a friendship with Theodora over the shared dining room table. It was not a large party, but it was warm and genuine, and the food was better than usual because Mrs. Jennings had made an effort, and there was apple cider that someone had brought and a small cake with white frosting. Florence gave a short toast that was so sincerely meant and gracefully worded that Theodora pressed her hand and had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Harvey stood and said that he had not expected his life to go this way, but that he was grateful it had, which was the most he had ever said in public about how he felt about anything, and it was enough and more than enough. They drove out to the land that evening, Harvey and Theodora, in the wagon he had borrowed from Gideon Prout's property, along with 2 of his own horses. The main room of the house was framed and roofed, with a proper wood floor and a stone fireplace that Harvey had built himself over the past 3 weeks with the help of a mason named Pete Garland, who had given him 2 days of time in exchange for a calf that Harvey had acquired as partial payment from a neighboring homesteader for fence repair work. The walls were not yet plastered. The window openings had oilcloth tacked over them, not glass, which would come in the spring. But there was a fire laid in the fireplace and the room smelled of fresh lumber and wood smoke, and when Theodora stepped inside and looked around, she put her hand over her mouth for a moment and then took it away and turned to look at Harvey with an expression that was not disappointment at all, was something much larger and quieter than that. "It's a good room," she said. "It's the beginning of a good room," he said. "That's what I mean," she said. That winter was a working winter. Harvey ran a small herd of 20 cattle on the homestead acreage, cattle he had purchased on credit from a sympathetic banker in Caldwell, who had looked at the land claim and the man presenting it, and made a judgment that the credit would be repaid. Theodora took in sewing work from women in town and from the ranch wives in the surrounding area, operating out of the corner of their main room where Harvey had built her a proper work table and installed the best oil lamp they could afford. She was steady and productive, and the income from her work in those first months was what kept their supplies coming while the cattle operation found its footing. They built the bedroom in February, working weekends, Harvey framing and Theodora doing the finish work that required precision rather than brute effort. The window glass came from Wichita in a careful shipment that Harvey transported himself, lying on a bed of straw in the wagon bed, and every mile of the return trip he worried about that glass the way he had never worried about anything in his working life. The glass arrived intact. Theodora pressed her hand against the first pane after he set it in the bedroom window and said there, with a satisfaction that told him she had been waiting for that specific quality of light, the real light, the kind that doesn't flatten like oilcloth does, the kind that changes through the day and makes a room feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Spring came gradually to the Kansas grasslands, the way it always did, not arriving so much as accumulating, warmth adding itself to the days in small increments, until one morning Harvey woke up, and the air through the window was genuinely soft, and the grass outside had gone the green of new growth, and he lay there for a moment and felt, in a way he had no words for, that he had arrived. He turned over and looked at Theodora, who was asleep beside him with her dark hair loose across the pillow and her right hand resting near her face with the turquoise ring visible, and he thought that, whatever the rest of his life brought, this was the center of it. He did not wake her to say so. He let her sleep, but later when she was at her sewing table and he was at the kitchen table with his coffee, he said, out of nowhere in the middle of the comfortable silence they had developed, "I am very glad you came west." She looked up from her work. "I am very glad of it too," she said, and went back to her stitching. He planted his east field with wheat in April, 20 acres of it, which was all he could manage that first season. He walked the rows himself, checking the soil with his hands, reading it the way a man learns to read things that matter to him. The soil was what he had hoped it was from that first afternoon at the creek, deep and dark and rich, with a quality that the thin-soiled Texas brush had never had. Theodora came out in the late afternoon when the planting was done and walked the field with him. She had brought 2 cups of coffee, carrying them carefully down the slope from the house, and they stood at the edge of the planted field and drank their coffee and watched the sun go down over the grasslands and the last light travel across the turned earth in sheets, the way Harvey had tried to describe to her once in the early days of their talking, and she had understood it then from his words, but now she understood it in her body, in the actual standing in it way that no description is a substitute for. "You were right about this land," she said. "I usually am about land," he said, which was not vanity, just an honest assessment of the thing he knew best. "You were right about other things too," she said, looking at him sideways. He waited. "About it not being a thing a person ought to do alone," she said. He looked out at the field and the sky and the wide, beautiful, serious country around them. "No," he said, "it isn't. The summer of 1879 was a good summer. The wheat came up and grew well, and Harvey sold his first crop at a price that covered his seed cost and his loan payment, and left a modest amount for the lumber to build the second bedroom and the proper kitchen addition he had been planning. The cattle were healthy. 2 of the cows dropped calves in June, and both calves were strong. Harvey hired a young man named Ezra Cole for the summer months to help with the cattle management, a 17-year-old boy from a homestead family 3 miles east who needed the work and had good instincts with animals. Theodora continued her sewing work, but had also begun to do something else, which was to teach. Florence Adair, who was still the school teacher in Caldwell, had mentioned in the spring that there were several children from the farming families south of town who could not make the 4-mile journey to school on a regular basis, and that the basics of reading and arithmetic were going untaught in those households. Theodora had mentioned this to Harvey, and Harvey had said, without any particular drama, that there was nothing stopping her from doing something about it if she wanted to, which was the most efficient form of encouragement he knew how to give. So on Wednesday afternoons, Theodora held school in their main room, with 4 children between the ages of 7 and 12, seated on wooden stools around her work table, learning to read from the 2 books she owned, a Bible and a copy of a history of the United States that had been her father's, and that she had carried west in the bottom of her trunk like ballast. She taught them arithmetic with small stones in rows on the table. She taught them to write their names first and then full sentences, on paper that she acquired carefully and used economically. Harvey came in from the fields on those Wednesday afternoons and understood from the sounds, the careful voices and the occasional burst of a child's laughter, what was happening in his house, and he felt something he could only describe to himself as rightness, the sense of a thing being exactly what it ought to be. The Hollies family lived 4 miles west of the Warren homestead, on a piece of land that had been filed in 1876 and was in the process of failing. Tom Hollies was a man who had come west with good intentions but without the particular combination of stubbornness, practicality, and physical endurance that the frontier required, and by the summer of 1879, his crop had failed for the 2nd year running, and his cattle were thin, and he owed the Caldwell Bank more than he could repay. His wife Ada was a small, quiet woman who came to Theodora's Wednesday school with her 2 children, and who sometimes stayed after the lesson was done, not because she had anything specific to say, but because she seemed to need to be somewhere that felt stable. Theodora did not pry. She made tea when she had it and coffee when she did not, and she listened to what Ada Hollis said and did not comment on what she did not say, which was the greatest kindness she could offer. When Tom Hollis announced in September that he was abandoning the claim and taking his family back east, Theodora felt the particular sadness of a person who has watched someone fight something that could not be won. She did not moralize about it. The frontier was genuinely difficult, and the promise of it was not equally available to all people, and she had enough honesty to acknowledge that some of what determined who succeeded and who did not was factors that had nothing to do with character or effort. The Homestead Act offered 160 acres to anyone willing to claim it, but it did not offer them rain or good soil or the knowledge of how to read a season or a lender willing to extend credit on the strength of a man's face. She and Harvey drove the Hollis family to the train depot in Caldwell when the day came, and Ada Hollis held Theodora's hands at the platform and cried without shame, and Theodora held her hands back and said that she was brave and she meant it. On the drive back from the depot, Harvey was quiet for a while and then said, "Ezra Cole's family is having trouble too." "I know," Theodora said. "His father's back isn't right, can't do the heavy work." "I know, Ezra mentioned it. I've been thinking I could offer them a piece of our east field to plant next spring, share the crop. They do the planting labor, we supply the seed, we split the harvest." Theodora looked at him. "That is a good plan. It keeps them on their land, and I get more acreage in production. It also keeps a good boy from having to make an impossible choice," she said, because she had been watching Ezra Cole work for 3 months, and she knew that the impossible choice was between staying with his family and leaving to find wages somewhere that might not exist. "There's that," Harvey said. They drove home through the September afternoon, through the grasslands that were going amber and gold again as they had when Theodora first walked them almost exactly a year before, and the house appeared ahead of them on the slight rise above the creek, solid and present in the landscape in a way that a house which is well built and lived in well earns. In October of 1879, Theodora told Harvey she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, in the same way she told him everything that mattered to her, directly and without theater, her eyes on his face and her hands wrapped around her cup. Harvey set his cup down carefully. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He nodded once, slowly, still processing. Then he said, "Good." She waited. "That is," he said, and stopped. "Harvey, I don't have a good word for this," he said honestly. "What I feel right now is bigger than anything I can say." "Then don't say it," she said. "I can see it." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment across the breakfast table in the kitchen of the house they had built together on the creek land in the Kansas grasslands. And Theodora looked back at him. And what passed between them in that look was something that took a whole year of shared life to make possible. The language of 2 people who know each other at a depth that has been built and not assumed. He came around the table and he held her carefully, the way he handled things he valued. The pregnancy progressed through the fall and winter. Theodora continued her work, adjusting her schedule as needed, because she was not a woman who treated her own body as an obstacle to be ignored, but neither was she one who treated ordinary life as a crisis. Harvey built the cradle himself, working on it in the evenings in the main room while Theodora sewed nearby, and the work was careful and slow, and he sanded every surface by hand 3 times until it was smooth enough that he could run his palm across it without feeling anything catch. Florence Adair came out from town twice a month on horseback to spend the afternoon, which was as much a social necessity for Theodora as it was a kindness on Florence's part, because a woman who lives 6 miles from town in her first pregnancy needs the company of another woman in the way that she needs clean water, not dramatized but simply required. Florence brought books when she came. She had access to the small lending collection that the Caldwell church maintained, and she brought whatever looked interesting without asking for instructions, which meant she brought a variety. And Theodora read through the winter evenings, while Harvey read the farming almanac or worked on accounts. And occasionally they traded books, and occasionally one of them read aloud to the other, which was something that had begun spontaneously one February evening and had since become a regular and valued part of their life together. Harvey's son was born in June of 1880. The labor was long, and the midwife, a woman named Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who had delivered most of the babies in the county for the past 10 years, was calm and competent throughout, which was precisely what was needed. Harvey waited in the main room for 7 hours, which was the longest 7 hours of his life by an enormous margin, doing nothing useful and knowing it, and not being able to do otherwise. When Mrs. Crane opened the bedroom door and said, "A boy, and he's strong," Harvey sat down on the nearest chair because his legs felt unreliable. The boy was named James, after Theodora's father. He was red-faced and loud and very healthy, and from the first moment Harvey held him, awkwardly but with great deliberateness, he felt something settle permanently into place, another element of the rightness he had first felt that spring morning looking at the light. Theodora lay in the bed with her eyes open, tired in a way that was deeper than any tiredness she had known, and she held out her right hand to Harvey when he came to sit beside her, and he took it, and the turquoise ring pressed gently against his palm. "He has your ears," she said. "I was going to say he has your eyes," Harvey said. "He has too much hair for a newborn," said Mrs. Crane from across the room, which made both of them laugh. James Warren grew up in the house by the creek. He was a serious, curious child who watched things carefully before he touched them, which was a quality his father recognized and his mother encouraged. By the time he was 3, he was following Harvey around the property with a small-scale seriousness that the ranch hands in the area found amusing, and that Harvey found, privately, one of the best things in his daily life. Theodora's Wednesday school had grown by 1881 to include 7 children from 4 neighboring homestead families, and she had written a letter, at Florence's urging, to the county school board about the possibility of a formal rural school being established. The county school board was a body that moved slowly, as governmental bodies do, but it moved, and by the end of that year there was a preliminary discussion about a schoolhouse building to be located on a central point in the farming area south of Caldwell. Harvey donated the land for the schoolhouse. He did this without consultation, which Theodora learned about after the fact, and she looked at him when he told her and said, "You might have mentioned it." "I thought you'd be pleased," he said. "I am pleased. I am also your wife, not a committee to be presented with decisions after they're made." He took this seriously because it was a serious point. "You're right," he said. "That was not well done." She looked at him for a moment. He met the look. "But I am pleased," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. "You know that, I hoped." The schoolhouse was built in the spring of 1882, a simple one-room frame structure with 6 windows and a good stove, and Florence Adair gave up her position in the Caldwell school to take the rural posting, because she said the salary was the same, and the commute was shorter, which was true in the sense that she had moved herself to a room in the Ezra Cole family's farmhouse, when the Cole family had expanded their dwelling the previous year using the crop-sharing proceeds. The arrangement between the Warren homestead and the Cole family had worked well. Ezra was 21 now and had become, quietly and through pure competent effort, Harvey's most trusted farmhand, employed full-time with a proper wage. His younger brother David had begun working on the property as well, and between the two of them and Harvey's own steadily growing operation, the Warren homestead was a producing ranch in the genuine sense, wheat and cattle both, with the wheat fields expanded to 60 acres by 1882 and the cattle herd standing at 42 head. Harvey had paid off his bank loan in 1881, ahead of schedule. He had told Theodora the night before he went to the bank to make the final payment, and she had taken out the household accounts book in which she kept meticulous records of every dollar spent and earned, and they had sat together at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers, and the numbers were good. Not wealthy, but stable and growing and built without deception or shortcuts, which was the only kind of financial stability that felt real to Harvey. Theodora was expecting again in the autumn of 1882. This time she told him at supper, because James was sitting at the table eating cornbread, and she thought it was appropriate for him to hear it, though he was only 2.5 and did not understand the import of what he heard. He did understand that something significant had happened, because both his parents were looking at each other in the way they sometimes did when something important was occurring, and he stopped eating his cornbread for a moment to watch them. Harvey said "good" again, which Theodora recognized as his word for the deepest things, the ones that exceeded his vocabulary. "Good," she agreed. "A girl was born in April of 1883. They named her Clara, after the bride whose sleeves had been such a subject of negotiation in Mrs. Carver's shop in that first autumn, because Theodora felt a small private gratitude to Clara Briggs, now Clara Morton, for having been her first real piece of work in Caldwell, and for having worn the dress so beautifully at her wedding that 2 other women had come to the shop the following week specifically because of what they had seen. Clara Warren was a different creature from her brother from the beginning. Where James was quiet and observational, Clara was immediate and vocal, with opinions from the first that were expressed with great energy and no apparent concern for whether the timing was convenient. She was, Harvey thought privately, very much like her mother in several essential respects, particularly the quality of absolute directness. He did not say this, because he understood it would be taken as a comment on Theodora rather than solely on Clara, which was not a diplomatic error he was willing to make. Theodora, for her part, looked at her daughter and saw clearly, and with affection, certain traits that she recognized from her own interior experience: the impatience with indirection, the strong feeling about the right way for things to be done, and she was tender with those traits in Clara in the way that a parent is tender with the things they recognize, understanding them from the inside. James took his sister's arrival with philosophical equanimity. He examined her carefully on the first day, walked back to the main room, and resumed his interrupted activity of sorting river stones on the floor, which told Harvey that the integration was proceeding normally. The years moved. The house expanded. The east bedroom became a room for the children, and Harvey built a second proper bedroom addition in 1884, larger and with 2 windows and a shelf along one wall that Theodora filled with books, the collection having grown considerably since Florence Adair had undertaken to supply them. The wheat field expanded again. Harvey bought out the quarter section adjacent to his homestead when its original claimant, a bachelor farmer named Reed, decided to move to Colorado for reasons of health, and the Warren homestead was now 240 acres. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle drives were declining by the mid-1880s, as Kansas began to restrict the movement of Texas cattle through the state due to the spread of tick fever to Kansas livestock. The town, which had grown through the drive years, was finding its new identity as a farming and trade community rather than a cattle trade hub. Some of the saloons closed or became something else. New businesses came. A proper doctor arrived in 1885 and set up a practice, which changed the quality of medical care available in ways that were directly and personally meaningful to families like the Warrens. Harvey had a conversation with the new doctor, a young man named Dr. Samuel Kellner, who had trained in St. Louis and come west because opportunity was more available there than in the established eastern cities, about preventive care, about the well-digging practices and food preservation methods that affected health outcomes in farming families. Harvey took the information seriously and applied it, because he applied most serious information seriously, and it was one of those unglamorous and entirely important decisions that shaped a life's trajectory without ever being the subject of dramatic remembering. In 1886, the rural school south of Caldwell held its first graduation ceremony, which was not a formal graduation in the sense that a city school would have, but was a recognized marking of the completion of a curriculum. And two of the children who had been in Theodora's Wednesday class in their main room were among the students who stood up that day and demonstrated their reading and their arithmetic. Theodora sat in the small audience with James on one side of her and Clara on the other and Harvey beside her, and she pressed her right hand flat against her knee and felt the ring under her palm. And she thought of her mother, of what her mother would have made of all this. This life so far from the Kentucky garden and the Illinois school, this house by the Kansas creek, these two children and this man and these students standing up in a little frame building to prove what they knew. She believed her mother would have understood it completely. She believed her mother would have recognized the logic of it, which was that a person who is loved well is capable of spreading that outward, and that the spreading is the point. Florence Adair was leaving. She had accepted a position with the county school board in Wichita, an administrative role that would allow her to work on expanding rural education throughout the county rather than a single classroom. She told Theodora on a Sunday afternoon in October of 1886, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and Theodora received the news with a pang that she acknowledged, and then set aside because the opportunity was too good for Florence, and the cause was too important to be treated as a personal loss. They held a small farewell supper, a larger gathering than the wedding supper 6 years before, because more people knew and valued Theodora and Harvey now, and more people knew and valued Florence. Ezra Cole attended with his new wife, a sensible and cheerful woman named Ruth whom he had married in the spring, and who was already, it was observed, expecting. The Crane family came, Dorothy the midwife and her husband. The new doctor attended. Several of the farming families from the surrounding area came, the ones whose children had been in the rural school. Harvey gave a toast to Florence that was short and exact and so well observed that Florence, who was not a sentimental woman, had to blink several times in quick succession. Theodora embraced her friend at the end of the evening and said, "Write to me. Every month without fail," Florence said. She kept this promise for the rest of both their lives. The winter of 1887 was hard. The cold came early and stayed, a deep, specific cold that settled into the plains with the determination of a creditor who has arrived early and intends to sit. The cattle required intensive attention, supplemental feed and constant monitoring for cold injury, and Harvey and the Cole brothers worked long days through December and January that started before the light and ended after dark. Theodora kept the house going with the competence of a woman who had been doing so through 4 Kansas winters, and who understood that a warm house and consistent meals were not small contributions to a working operation in difficult weather. James, who was 7, helped in every way his size and age permitted, which was more than would have been expected, but less than his serious nature felt was sufficient. He wanted to do more, and Harvey understood this, and gave him more than was strictly necessary so that the boy could feel useful, which he was. Clara, who was not yet 4, was a source of ongoing warmth in the house through that winter, because she had no concept of conditions being difficult and treated every snowfall as a personal opportunity, and every cold meal as an occasion for comment, and the stream of her observations and opinions kept the household from becoming as somber as the weather. Harvey got frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand in January, a consequence of going out to check the cattle in a wind that dropped the temperature well below what anyone had intended to be working in. Theodora treated it carefully according to what the doctor had told her about such injuries, which was to warm the tissue gradually rather than suddenly, and to watch for infection. She sat with him that night with his hand wrapped and the fire going, and she was calm and attentive and did not tell him he had been foolish, because he knew that in saying it accomplished nothing. "It doesn't hurt badly," he said. "It will tomorrow," she said, which was accurate. "I know, Harvey, I know. I stayed out too long." "You did," she said. "Don't do it again." "I won't." He was quiet for a moment. The fire made its sound and the cold pressed against the windows. "Theodora," he said, "I want to say something." She waited because she recognized the tone. "I know I am not a man who says things often," he said. "That is my nature and it's not likely to change, but I want you to know what you have made of this place, of this life, of me. I am aware of it every day. I don't take a day of it for granted." She looked at him for a long time. The firelight moved across his face, the face she knew entirely now, every line and expression of it, the way it changed when he was thinking through a problem versus when he was at peace, the particular quality of his attention when he was looking at something he loved. She reached out and put her left hand over his bandaged right one, carefully. "I know," she said. "So do I." The spring that followed the hard winter was one of genuine renewal in the most physical sense. The ground thawed with a richness that suggested the winter had done the soil a favor, and Harvey's wheat planting in April went into earth that was deeply prepared. The calves born that spring were strong. Ezra Cole and Ruth had their baby in March, a healthy boy they named Thomas, and Theodora brought meals to them for the first week and held the baby while Ruth slept and felt, holding that infant, a warm and uncomplicated happiness for two young people beginning something. James turned 8 and was old enough to begin serious work alongside his father, not play work but real work with real stakes, and Harvey taught him the way he did everything else, clearly and without impatience, showing the thing once and then asking the boy to do it and watching carefully and correcting what needed correcting. James learned fast and remembered well, and had a feel for animals that his father recognized as something that could not be taught, something that was simply in the composition of a person. Clara turned 5 and began her schooling. With Florence in Wichita and the rural schoolhouse now staffed by a young teacher named Mr. Perkins, who had come from Ohio with more formal training than frontier experience, Theodora supplemented Clara's education at home in the evenings, teaching her to read with the same stones and Bible and United States history that she had used in the Wednesday school. Clara learned with tremendous speed and enthusiastic imprecision, which is to say she grasped the concept of each thing immediately, and then required some sustained work on accuracy, which was a pattern that Theodora found familiar and somewhat endearing. By 1889, the Warren homestead was what it had always been intended to be. 240 acres of working land, wheat and cattle both, a house with 4 proper rooms and a kitchen, and a covered porch that Harvey had added the previous summer, and on which Theodora kept a rocking chair and a small table for her coffee cup and her mending, a barn that was sound and large, a root cellar, a proper well, and a kitchen garden behind the house that produced through the summer and into the fall and whose excess was put up in preserves and dried stores for the winter. Harvey had paid off every debt. He owned his land, his animals, and his equipment without obligation. He was not wealthy in the way of men who had found oil or silver or had inherited money, but he was free in a very specific and earned way that he valued more than wealth would have meant without it. Theodora still took sewing commissions, not because it was necessary, but because she valued the work and the connection it maintained with women in the surrounding area, the regular human contact that was one of the genuine costs of living 6 miles from town. She had begun to teach James and Clara to sew as well, not as a gendered expectation, but as a practical skill, because she believed that anyone who was going to wear clothing ought to understand how it was made and how to maintain it. James took to it with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything. Clara took to it with enthusiasm and speed and a tendency to skip steps, which required ongoing negotiation. Florence wrote every month, as promised. Her letters were long and detailed, and full of the kind of observation that made Theodora feel she was present in Wichita alongside her friend, watching the school board meetings and the political discussions, and the arguments about what rural education ought to accomplish and for whom. Florence was doing important work. Theodora told her so in every return letter and meant it. In the late summer of 1889, Harvey and Theodora drove to Caldwell together for a supply run, a trip they made monthly, and they walked the main street of the town together in a way they had been walking main streets together for 10 years now. The town was different from the one she had stepped into on that July afternoon in 1878. Some buildings were gone. Others had replaced them. The Frontier House Hotel was still there, with a new coat of paint. Mrs. Carver's dress shop was still there, though Mrs. Carver had taken on a partner, a younger woman who now ran the day-to-day operation while Mrs. Carver supervised. The livery stable where Harvey had been standing when the coach arrived was still there. They stopped outside the hotel not by plan but by mutual recognition, the kind that happens between two people who have been together long enough to have a shared history of places. "That window," Theodora said, looking up at the second floor. "That was my room, the back corner." "I was over there," Harvey said, nodding toward the livery across the street. "I know," he looked at her. "You know, you noticed me then." She gave him the look, the one that was equal parts affection and mild superiority. "Harvey, I notice everything. I did not know that. I know you did not know that." He looked at her for a moment and then he laughed, which was a sound she had never gotten used to in the best way, because it was rare enough to be a genuine pleasure when it arrived. "You could have said something," he said. "You said something first," she said. "That was right. You asked about the ring before dark." They stood there on the Caldwell boardwalk in the late summer sun, 10 years and more after that afternoon, and Theodora raised her right hand and looked at the turquoise ring in the light. It was the same ring it had always been. The gold band was slightly more worn. The turquoise was unchanged, the same pale blue with its faint interior variation, the stone that had belonged to her mother and had been bought from a trader in Kentucky by a young woman who could not have imagined what journey the ring would travel after her. Harvey looked at the ring with her. He thought about that first afternoon, the flash of gold across the dust, the impulse to ask, the conversation before dark that had started everything. "I was afraid you'd tell me it was none of my business," he said. "I considered it," she said, "and then I thought, here is a man who looked at a ring and wanted to know its story. That is the kind of man worth talking to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think about that afternoon more than you might expect." "I think about it too," she said. "I think about being afraid on the coach and about the sun when I stepped down and about this ring catching the light and about you standing over there." "You told me you weren't going to romanticize things," he said. "I said I did not romanticize things," she said. "This is not romanticization. This is simply the truth." He took her hand. Not the right hand with the ring but the left, the one with his gold band on it, the one that had been wearing his ring for 10 years. He held it the way he held it whenever he held it, with care and certainty. "Theodora," he said. "Harvey," she said. They walked back to the wagon hand in hand on the Caldwell Main Street in the last good heat of the summer of 1889, past the hotel and the dress shop and the livery stable, and all the accumulated geography of the place where their life together had begun. And the sun was in the west, and the shadows were long and the grasslands beyond the town were golden in the evening light, and the road south toward the creek, and the house, and the children was the road they knew best in the world. James was 9 and Clara was 6, and they were, at this exact moment, being watched over by Ezra Cole's wife Ruth, which was a standing arrangement that worked well for everyone. The root cellar was stocked for winter. The wheat was in. The cattle were fat and the creek was running well. The house was sound and full of books and the smell of wood smoke and the voices of people who lived in it as if they meant to. On the drive back, with the wagon rocking gently on the familiar road, and the evening coming in across the grasslands, Theodora leaned against Harvey's shoulder the way she did on long drives, and he put his free arm around her the way he did when she did that, and they drove home through the Kansas evening without particular conversation, because they were past the point of needing conversation to feel present to each other. The silence between them was so established and comfortable that it was its own kind of speech. The years ahead would bring more of the same life, which is to say more of the specific and unrepeatable texture of a life being fully lived. James would grow into a young man who was as good with cattle as his father and better with wheat, having a farmer's instinct for soil that Harvey would recognize and celebrate without jealousy. Clara would grow into a young woman of such decisive intelligence and energy that her parents would be simultaneously exhausted by her and profoundly proud. And she would teach school herself eventually, in the schoolhouse that sat on the land Harvey had donated, teaching children whose parents she would know by name and whose futures she would feel genuinely invested in. There would be one more child born in 1891, a second son they named William, after no one in particular, but because both of them liked the name and agreed on it, which was the kind of agreement that by that point in a marriage felt like a small and pleasant gift after years of learning to navigate disagreement well. William would be the most immediately social of their three children, easy and cheerful in a way that was all his own. The Cole family would prosper on the adjacent land. Ezra Cole would eventually buy his own acreage when it became available, and his family and the Warren family would be neighbors in the deep sense that frontier neighbors became neighbors, tied by shared seasons and shared emergencies and shared celebrations, until the distinction between neighbor and family was merely technical. Florence Adair would return to the area in 1895, having accomplished considerable things with the county school board, and she would take a position as the head of the rural school district and live in Caldwell again, and Theodora would have her friend back within reasonable visiting distance, which was a happiness of the uncomplicated and sustaining kind. Harvey Warren would file for a deed of clear ownership on the 240 acres in 1893, when the homestead's 5-year improvement requirement had been long since met and exceeded, and he would hold that deed in his hands in the land office with the same expression he wore when he held things that were genuinely his, quiet and sure, and without display. He would bring the deed home and show it to Theodora at the kitchen table, spreading the paper flat between their coffee cups, and she would read it through carefully, every line, and then look up at him and say, "This is everything you said it would be." "Nearly," he said. "There's still the north fence to replace." "Harvey," she said, with affectionate exasperation, which was one of their primary languages. "There's still the north fence," he said, and smiled at her. She looked at the deed again and then at the ring on her right hand, which she wore every day, every season, in every weather, as her mother had worn it before her. The turquoise was the same pale blue. The gold was worn smooth at the edge from years of contact with the world. All the fabric and soil and wood and cold water and children's hair that had passed against it. It was more beautiful than it had been when she left Illinois, not because it had changed, but because she understood now what it meant to wear something through a whole life, to carry a piece of the past into the present every day without it being a burden, to feel it on your hand in the morning, and know that the person it came from would have understood you, understood the choices you made, and the roads you took, and the man you chose, and the land you built on. Understood all of it because she raised you, and she knew what she was raising. On a September evening in 1893, Harvey and Theodora sat on the covered porch of their house with the rocking chair and the small table, and the Kansas grasslands were going gold in the last light of the afternoon, and James was in the barn attending to something with the cattle, and Clara was inside doing her lessons with the focused intensity she brought to everything, and baby William was asleep, and the creek made its sound in the middle distance, and the sky was the specific deep blue of a clear plains evening. Harvey was in his chair and Theodora was in hers, and their coffee cups were on the table between them, and the day was ending in the way that good days do, slowly and with beauty, giving you time to be aware of what you have. "Harvey," Theodora said, he said, "when you asked me about the ring, that first day." "What about it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Were you afraid that I would think it was strange, a man asking a strange woman about her jewelry?" He thought about this honestly. "Yes," he said. "A little. Why did you do it then?" He looked out at the grasslands for a moment. "Because it was beautiful and it meant something." You could see that it meant something from across the street. Things that mean something should be asked about, seemed to me. Theodora looked at the ring. Then she looked at the grasslands and the sky and the house behind them, solid and warm and full of the life they had made inside it, and then she looked at Harvey beside her in the evening light. "I am glad you were brave," she said. He looked at her. The evening light was in her face, and she was 41 years old, and she was the most known and knowable person in his life, and he was glad of it every day in the quiet particular way that he was glad of things, not loudly but completely. "So am I," he said. The sun finished going down. The sky above the Kansas plains moved through its colors, amber and rose, and then the deep clear blue that comes just before dark. And they sat on their porch in the last of the light with their coffee cups, and the sound of the creek, and the sounds of their children, and the sound of the wind in the grassland grass. And the ring on Theodora's hand caught the very last moment of the day's light, and sent a thin, bright needle of gold through the dusk. The same gold that had caught Harvey's eye 16 years before and started everything, still catching light, still wearing its meaning, still keeping faith with the woman who had worn it first, and the woman who wore it now, and the life that had been built around the small, brave act of noticing it, and asking, before dark, about the story it carried.